Many Voices, Chapter 2. It has been my good fortune to meet a number of those who are already among the immortals of Irish literature. A.E., in brackets, George William Russell, close bracket, was one whom I especially revered. Though he came from the north of Ireland, he was educated near Dublin, and he certainly seemed to belong to Ireland's fair city. I also knew friends of his family, the Lambert family, well known in Meath, where I was born, who regarded him as a promising painter. I believe also that Yeats, whom I knew better in later years, suggested that A.E. should have continued to paint, though he could not have been more than 40 at the time. A.E. seemed old to me. It was soon after he had given up his editorship of the Irish Statesman, copies of which my uncle always had in his house, that I met him again. He was not only a patriot, in the best sense of the word, but he had a deep understanding of his people and of the legends of Ireland. He read Greek. In his presence one felt the aura and wisdom of a Greek philosopher, but first and foremost, he was a poet. He possessed a rich voice, a lively imagination, and infinite charm. From the very first moments when I knew him, he became enshrined as a symbol of goodness. When I next met A.E. on my visit to Ireland to see my aunt, he seemed suddenly to have aged. I had written to him for an appointment, and when I met him, he was accompanied by Catherine Tingley, the famous American theosophist, who was a close friend of his. He seemed to have lost some of the old glint in his eyes, and he pulled incessantly on a pipe. He remembered me as the unruly one, which may indeed have been an accurate description. He wanted to know all that had happened to me. I spoke rapidly, telling him of my need of his counsel. "Hold it now, not so fast," he interrupted. "There is a timbre? I think the word is timbre, Timbre, in your voice that I hope you'll never lose. Although my father was a musical man," he continued, "I don't carry a tune, but I can always listen to a good speaking voice. Never let anyone interfere with it." Puzzled, I asked him why. "Didn't you come to me for advice?" he said. "Well, I think you may have the makings of an actress." And he went on to say there was always a need of good workers at the Abbey Theatre. This was flattering and most unexpected, and I felt awed. But I need not have worried too much, for later on, when I did take his advice, I was put to a job of mending and sewing of heavy curtains, tapestry, and effects, for which I had no great love. Later, I returned to my husband in a better frame of mind. These were people of my own blood, each with his own remote wisdom, so different from my English friends. Each had assured me that life itself would in time give me the finer perceptions and reasonings to guide the inner motivations and externalize them. I returned to my marriage obligations, realizing that I must continue within the outward world's order and constraint, even though an inner world was fast taking over to give me a secret sense of calm. Of course, I also suspected that my husband and doctor probably considered that my preoccupations with an inner world might lead to a state of unbalance. I bore 3 sons to Clive. 2 of them died at a very young age in a serious epidemic of meningitis, when that disease was not well understood as it is today. My 3rd son died a few hours after birth. The loss of my 3 children left me spiritually exhausted and unable to deal with the conventional sympathies of the family. I had to find strength within myself to face the routine of daily life, but this was made difficult by many factors. The plausible words of friends and family who explained that the loss of my sons was God's will, and this did nothing to give me helpful answers, nor were my prospects for the future helped by the rector of the church, whose statements were inevitably those that bespoke the need for faith. The sacraments no longer had real meaning. I remembered that nature deals with her kingdom, her children, and her seasons without mystery. Little animal that I was, I dispensed with speculation, and finally with the religious rites so deeply embedded in the nature of my environment. I turned instinctively toward animism and the personification of nature, using her unique magic to heal me. My energy again needed an outlet beyond my house and husband. I interested myself in social work in the East End of London. This took care of my physical energies, but it gave no real interior satisfaction. I went to the other extreme and renewed my interest in the theater. I found this intensely satisfying, but Clive and his family were displeased and insisted that I had social obligations to my marriage and to his friends. My hopes of being economically independent were temporarily laid aside. Outwardly, I remained docile to my husband's wishes and enjoyed the objective, carefree life of suburbia, but the interior world continued to beckon. News now came that my aunt, Martha, who had become grievously bedridden, was sinking fast. My husband advised that I return home to Ireland. I went back to be greeted coldly by her many relatives and friends. I had never known there were so many. I sought the rooms of dreams in which I had grown up, and when I could get away, I went to the woods, the River Boyne, and all the other secret places of my childhood. I was hardly aware that I had left them. The magic of childhood returned. My aunt was not particularly pleased to see me. Old, frail, and near to death, there was still disapproval in her weary voice. I remained until the spark of that indomitable flame flickered out, but I could not go to the funeral to make myself a part of the family group which had gathered at that doleful shrine. I visited Dublin on my way back to London. In doing so, I found that it was not alone the dutiful attachment to my aunt which had compelled me to return, but a desire to see some of my own people, to discuss the complexities of my demanding inner nature. I loved Clive in an outward and physical fashion. I was happy to be his wife, but the social life and the overprotective attitude toward me were difficult to accept. Looking back over my dual life, I know now that he must have been greatly worried on my account. The importance I attached to the growing mystical experiences in my daily life left him confused and disappointed. I was happy to return to him, and I acknowledged the need to be just and temperate, as he often advised. Yet there was also the need to be able to feel anger and passion, and to have the winds of life, calm or violent, flow through me. I knew his wisdom and good sense were right for me, But life also demanded a valor of the soul, and the senses were being bombarded with facets of other desires that were a challenge to my own intelligence. With the emotions of curiosity, eagerness, hope, and love of life, I began to make up to him for what I felt within myself was an unsatisfactory image of what a wife should be. In these months, I believe I achieved a spiritual understanding of what human companionship and love could bring to a marriage. But before I could be truly sure that I had achieved a sustaining and lasting relationship, the First World War started in 1914. The emotional upheaval in England filled me with a new sense of humility. The need of the people gave me inspiration in the face of the disaster from which no one person could withdraw. The continual suffering over the loss of the men of England demanded from each one an intelligent dependence upon himself. Life for the women became a thing of instinctive achievement. The total sense of action grew until each was stimulated beyond failure. Clive, like many others of his age, had been training in the Territorial Army during summer vacations, and he found himself quickly transferred to duty abroad. Women of all ages watched the thin khaki line of men melt into the shadowy army that took off for war. The independence that I craved was not mine to use for reflection. There was not even time for regret. It was a time for work. The war was no longer for men alone. Women now worked in the factories, hospitals, and newly arranged clinics, as well as close to the battlefields, where men, welded together in the strong tragedy, fell dead and wounded, some to return pitifully soon, almost as soon as the battle had begun. My husband returned to London to undergo a period of training for a commission, but he would leave again soon. The great Holocaust of war demanded duty from one and all, though no one then suspected that the meteor streak of England's greatness had begun to grow dim. Though no one then suspected that the meteor streak of England's greatness had begun to grow dim. Philosophers have said that man will accept the yoke if he can be assured of hope to sustain him. Nations old and young accepted the burden of war and prayed to survive. It was then that I had seriously to examine myself, to understand my animal spirits and how eternal objects impress the senses to produce continual inner communication with the world of nature, a communication which made those who knew me feel that I was different in quotes. I believed then, as I do now, that the power of nature is so vast and ample that she produces within all of us the way to communicate with her, but perhaps some of her ways are obscure. The truths which I had to learn and the disciplines and rules of the outside world I had to acquire gave me new truths in proportion to my search. The abstract march of inner events with their external practical patterns, which were later to be described as telepathic, continued to reveal to me happenings outside of the self and brought me face to face with the many levels of reality. I was continually receiving new sensations in waking or dreaming states. I had the capacity to see and know more than I was able to digest. I knew that only work, and plenty of it, would deal with these new sensations in a space-time unity. The dualism of my nature demanded that I busy myself in an external world where this otherness of ideas could be translated into a more objective energy. I finally decided to open a tea room in Heath Street, Hampstead, and to this my husband reluctantly agreed. Long accustomed to the deep seclusion on the farm in Ireland, I also felt the need to be closer to the earth, and I chose Hampstead because of the large expanse of open heathland, which was within walking distance of the cafe. Life at the farmhouse, at home too, had prepared me for a life of work. I was certain that the conventional but easy life of my husband and his associates was not the ultimate route for me. They were wise and well ordered in their lives, but wisdom, when it is contained in the mind alone, causes the heart to suffer if there is not also work to be accomplished. Nothing is more therapeutic than the work of the body and the mind in unison. A small but perpetual business life, which demanded thoughtfulness to each daily task, kept me nourished. Thoughts flowed out unchecked to form themselves into a world of symbols and fantasy that could not be described as either physical or mental. My interior life continued from darkness to sunshine without need of words. Employed happily in the work which the cafe demanded of me, my feet carried me from one task to another. Happy as the animals, careless as the flowers and the birds. The tea shop prospered and finally became a meeting place for young people in the afternoons and evenings. People from London dropped in for a light meal and an occasional coffee, but mostly to talk with their friends until the late hours. Thus, the nights became a rendezvous for writers who lived around Hampstead and for those returning from their work at Fleet Street. Among the crowd that came for coffee was one young man who, because of his bearded appearance, was referred to by the Fleet Street group as JC, in brackets, Jesus Christ. He had exchanged a few banalities with me now and then, but he usually preferred to sit in seclusion at his table where he drank cocoa and wrote. I took little note of him, although his appearance each evening became part of the nightly setting. Many of the young people who were painters and writers greeted him very casually. He obviously had many friends in the neighborhood, but he chose his table by the window in the cafe and there concentrated on his writing. I finally discovered that he was dhlawrence. I was interested in the young writer, but was somewhat repelled by the troubled and unhappy look in his eyes. We developed between us a sign language which served us both. He would point to his cup when he needed replenishing rather than loudly bang on his plate when he needed food. He was oddly jealous if anyone else sat at this particular place, and he would hover around the interloper until the table was vacated. I got into the habit of serving him myself. He repeatedly told me to stop working and to have the courage to be a woman, a remark that meant nothing to me then. He lived at Bryan Villas in the Vale of Health in Hampstead, and I believe he was rather short of money, for sometimes he would suddenly explain before he left, "I don't have any money. I will probably pay you tomorrow." I believe he was writing copiously at this time. He complained of the weather, the bad life, and difficult friends, but his health seemed to be his chief concern. Occasionally, he was affable and chatted with the young painters and writers. The effect of the war troubled him greatly, and when the Zeppelins raided London, as they did in 1916, he sometimes expressed the hope that the world would be blown up. He once asked me about my religion, and I replied that I just wanted to believe in a merciful Father who would keep us from the inevitable hazards of war. Lawrence told me then that he loved no one, although at this period of his life I gathered he had a certain affection for Bernard Shaw and for A.R. Orage, O-R-A-G-E, then editor of New Age. He often spoke of the latter in glowing terms and would urge me to read the publication. His moods were many and unpredictable. There were moments when he liked the young people who came and went, and then again he would ignore them. He once told me he knew that I didn't approve of him. It was hardly true. I was sympathetic because of his great and unkempt appearance, but I did not admire his red beard, and I felt he might have been better looking without it. Lawrence gave the impression that he bore with people only because they were around him. He spoke so much of evil. Men's ways are evil, he would reiterate, that it finally repelled me. The evil attitude of people, in fact, was usually his theme when he did not condescend to talk with those who greeted him. Most of the time he remained remote, often talking to himself, as though his thoughts demanded to be voiced aloud. The young people who had at first sought him out soon left him to his writings and broodings. One day, Lawrence announced that he was leaving Hampstead to find a better climate. He talked of living in South Africa, but always as though it were something in the remote future. Finally, he announced one evening that he had to leave the region because the people to whom his house belonged were coming back. He felt that this move would be therapeutic, since the veil of health only nourished the darkness of the soul. The veil, V-A-L-E with a capital V, of health, capital H, the veil of health only nourished the darkness of the soul. And he hoped that in Cornwall, where he would be close to the sea, he would find a sense of consciously belonging. I believe he went to Cornwall and lived there for a time. Later, when he returned to London, he sought me out on many occasions. Later in life, I was often to hear him discussed by the Huxleys and other writers who knew him well and even professed to love him deeply. Maria Huxley was one of those who went to care for him when he was sick and dying at Venice in the south of France. Aldous Huxley spoke of him with great affection and praised his poetry and his prose, although Aldous himself could be negative at times about Lawrence's personality. Later on, I knew Mrs. Jessie Chambers. Who figured in one of his novels and who spoke of him with infinite tenderness. As time went on, I met many people whose lives he had deeply touched. Yet I found it difficult to believe that he would spare love for anyone but himself. His literary talents were more creative than was revealed to me in those early days. His nature did not permit him to give of himself easily. D.H. Lawrence remains in my mind as a man who was not able to nourish a capacity for deep feeling. I never felt that he had the good fortune to make people properly responsive to him. He gave the impression that he chose his friends with full knowledge of their weaknesses. His feelings, which he shared with many of his friends, such as Middleton Murray and Catherine Mansfield, revealed a basic element of unconscious cruelty, which I often thought was asserted toward the very people who sat at his feet and truly gave themselves to understanding him. D.H. Lawrence spoke of his contempt for the world, but maybe also a little of it was for himself. Association with the outside world had given me a rippling sense of assurance and peace of mind. Work was therapeutic in a suffering and demanding world. There were the moments of relaxation when the mind, that great weaver of dreams, took over to assure me of its own dynamic levels outside the conscious external balance which I knew I must demand for myself. There were difficulties and perplexities aplenty, and yet I was able to carry on my considerable workaday business with security and confidence, for I now accept as normal and with gladness and acuteness that there were many levels to my being, that I could work well on these separate levels, and that I was not different. During this period of work, a daughter was born to me. Clive, again, returning on leave, had little sympathy for my continual desires to be free and to live an independent existence, but I knew I was committed to my own way of life. Much later he agreed, and with an amicable divorce, and an amicable divorce was arranged. While waiting for my freedom, I disposed of the tea shop and opened a hostel for wounded soldiers in need of rest and recuperation before returning to active duty. This brought me a greater sense of being useful to the war effort, and especially as I managed to work for the hospital nearby whenever I could. I had secured a nurse for my small daughter, who was out of town, away from the menacing Zeppelin raids on London. The hostel was near the Euston, Euston, and St. Pancras, Pancras, railway stations, and I would take the wounded and shell-shocked soldiers, those well enough to be moved, to the underground stations during these bombardments. The dark screen of fear revealed in each one during these nights gave me a sense of their belonging to me as children. This afforded me a wider participation in their lives, especially as I saw in quotes, events, mostly grave, which were to befall them. Many of those lives were to end too soon. The world around us was full of hurt, and I was deeply moved to help each and all. It was then that I discovered I could project myself into their lives and look for healing within myself, where I found lights and values for their greater peace of mind. Among the group, there was one boyish young man to whom I was attracted. He was artistic, but painfully sensitive, and when war experiences were discussed, he became unhappy. Never robust, he had joined up as a soldier only because it was the decent thing to do. When the time came near for him to rejoin his regiment, he had a horrible premonition that he would be killed. We had seen a good deal of each other, and he asked me to marry him. When my divorce became absolute, it was easy and seemed perfectly natural to grant his wish and give him the brief happiness for which he yearned. Within a month, he was dead. Dining with some friends at the Savoy Hotel in London one evening, I had clairvoyantly seen my young husband blown up with 2 or 3 other people. He appeared to be caught up by the smoke and explosion within a sea of sound, even to be part of the dread experience. I became ill and begged to be excused. A few days later, I was advised by the War Office that he was among the missing. His brother officers later wrote that he had gone on a wire-cutting expedition and never returned. Years later, I saw his name on the Menace Gate Memorial at Ypres, Ypres. Only I knew the manner in which he had died. No, only I knew the manner in which he had died. I was again alone, and for a time suffered the invasion of many extraneous experiences. The evil of war dragged on. Relations and friends died by the authority of the warlords. 4 years of bloodshed convinced me. 4 years of bloodshed forced one to industry. One became the daughter of time and obeyed its authority. Men were becoming scarce as the noblest and youngest were wiped out, and then in turn their fathers. The gods were not easily satisfied by the sacrifice in which the Western world was finally engaged. Arbitrary restrictions were the order of my daily life. My health collapsed twice under the strain, but I was quick to recover and find new ways to serve. 3 weeks before the armistice was declared, I married again. A need to be wanted became urgent. James William Garrett, one of my many wounded friends, had asked me to visit him at a nearby hospital where he was waiting to learn whether an amputation of one of his legs would be necessary. The doctors had virtually agreed that otherwise gangrene would set in and threaten his life. But as I discussed the situation with my soldier, I felt deep within me that this operation was not needed. But the doctors say that there's no way out except amputation, he told me. Hold on there, I countered. You asked me to be your wife. Well, I will. As your wife, I'll be able to talk to the doctors in a way that otherwise I cannot. I know. I simply know that there are other ways of treating this condition, and I will refuse to let them go ahead. I married James William Garrett. There was no operation, and his leg was saved. The marriage ceremony was of little material importance. It was the need to help and heal that was uppermost. By then I knew that the springs of human needs were complex and compelling. I had become a thoroughgoing determinist who wanted to give the force of life a meaning, its right to survive. When the armistice was signed, I suddenly felt that an artery had been severed. The gleaming sword of necessity had been laid aside. One felt immediately exhilarated and happy, but there was also a sense of being lost, and strangely, a sense of despair. For 4 years, every moment of one's life had been regimented to do the one thing that was most essential for the help of others. There were no wasted moments in our lives then, and in consequence, we were much nicer, kinder people. It was a time of despair, a time of exaltation, a time of very hard work, and yet a time of relief in the odd sense, because everyone had his task set. There was a period of exhaustion which finally came to an end with the armistice, to bring what was called peace. It was this peace rather than war which shook my belief in anything that the scriptures had to teach. Some there were who may have expected a happy time when the men came marching home, who thought all would be well again. But the country was full of desperately wounded men. The wild exultation of war was over, and the hard times began. 2 generations of men had been lost to us. There remained only the old men and the very young ones, who had mercifully been too young to be dragged into the Holocaust, and those between had been wiped out forever. I recalled that my feelings at that time were not of joy, but of anger. The word armistice was not enough after 4 years of war. One had heard the refrains, "When the boys come marching home," and how fine it would be when they would sit again at their firesides. But one knew that there were dark days ahead before the dreams and hopes of a peaceful fireside could be realized. When my husband was released from the hospital, we had to seek suitable living quarters. Then I began to look anew on the changing face of Britain and to anticipate a place for myself within that changing scene. People were no longer soaring on the wings of imagination. Mind and body were given to the grim necessity for each and all to find a place to live and to work. The task for the individual appeared to be ending, while actually it was only beginning again, but to be regulated by other principles and other events. The reformers arose to take upon themselves the task of reshaping the laws which we had almost lost sight of, those that preserved the general good of mankind. The transfer from the tragic years of war to the uneasy peace brought hardship and discomfort to everyone. No one in his senses believed that a permanent victory had been won. Europe had been drained of spiritual resources, and her political and economic needs brought drastic social changes to the country. The immensity of the effort to be made was to be taken in hand by the Fabian Society. I had turned my attention to them, believing, as did many others of the younger generation, that their proposals contained constructive elements. Their intention was to restore the equilibrium of the war-torn isles by a process of political education. I had taken time to understand socialism from such exciting people as Clement Attlee, Ramsay MacDonald, Harold Lasky, H.G. Wells, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb, as well as a host of young writers and thinkers. While the Church failed to give answers, the Fabians produced for me a creed of democracy more to my liking. As a group, they were both loved and detested. They were hardworking, vigorous, and very little understood. These remarkable people knew that the economic tempo of the world was calling aloud for progressive change. Revolution was always in my blood. As a youngster at school, I listened to John Redmond, John Dillon, and William O'Brien demanding independence for Ireland. While I had little sympathy with the Irish cause and its sentimentality, I was carried away by the force and the nobility of their words, and I did have sympathy with the individuals, many of whom truly believed that Ireland would once again become a great nation. Somehow it seemed to me as though the war in France and the fighting in Ireland were one and the same thing, that the seeds of both were, in a sense, the stuff of revolution. There were very few people to whom I could speak of this. Sidney and Beatrice Webb understood. I listened to George Bernard Shaw with respect, but neither his looks nor his disposition were to my general liking. I found him altogether too brusque and too voluble. There were times when he greeted one with aplomb and courtesy, but at other moments there was a mean glitter in his eyes, and he was capable of saying things that would hurt unnecessarily. He had the gift of gab, and it might be said that he disliked everything on principle. One felt that his rhetoric covered weakness and insincerity. I suspect he was a man frightened of his own emotions. H.G. Wells was different. He was an irascible man, but also a man of wide vision and wider speculation. He was convinced that the good life, as it had been known in pre-war days, was gone forever. This caused him to cross words on the subject of British supremacy with those deeply concerned with British restoration, and his sarcastic wit enlivened the meetings. I looked forward to being useful within the community and started planning a labor hostel to receive delegates representing the newly formed trades union from the different provinces. At that time, until the general strike in 1926, there was greater comradeship and political union among these so-called labor leaders that I have ever again encountered. Many of them had been through terrible times, and they felt and thought in terms of suffering. They had a deep sense of purpose and knew something of inspired leadership. The plans for my hostel went ahead, spurred by the faith of Edward Carpenter. He was then in his 70s. I met him at the Fabian meetings, and we became great friends on the basis of our common interest in the impending social changes. His own great love of his fellowmen drew me to him. I found that I could reveal to him my inner and objective impressions. He listened sympathetically while I reviewed my early childhood experiences, made me understand what he called my miraculous spectrum, and finally told me that I was indeed gifted with an overdose of cosmic consciousness. I was able to turn to him for understanding of the religious and democratic movements. He singled out several groups for my attention, but warned me to look and listen. Your life will never be dull, he advised, as long as the quest for knowledge gives interest to your thoughts. Better, he quoted, to travel hopefully and thoughtfully than to arrive. He taught me that the ancient creeds were themselves projections of the human mind. One may not forget that there are no shadows on the wall if the fires within are not burning. The internal fires we cannot see, for we appear to be in our own way. Edward Carpenter taught me that deep down in the human mind there is a blazing light of world consciousness, so deep within each of us that the vast majority of people are afraid to find out. He taught me to respect the formative urge to be independent that was again rising to the surface. Long years of war had broken up old institutions. Religions had given way before the necessity to survive. Pain brought its own illumination. Intuitive understanding took over, and animism seemed a logical and necessary way of regarding all these fragments into which life had splintered. The lure of the mysterious, the fascination with occult lores, had spread enormously since the end of the war. Secret societies for adepts sprang up all over London. Aleister Crowley's ritualistic Black Mass attracted many of those seeking diversion from the grim economic struggle. At his well-attended classes, he read aloud, giving his own interpretations of the grimoires from Arabic sources. One learned how to make waxen images of those with whom life had become unpleasant, and with knife and fire to play out the rituals prescribed. Lectures were given on the secrets of the secrets of the Kabbalah. At most, I regarded all these practices as man's attempt to subdue nature. Nevertheless, a remarkable variety of facts and profound primitive knowledge were being absorbed by me and stored in my subconscious mind. The humanitarian ideals of Edward Carpenter had given me a need to participate in the changing scene in England. Between industry and labor, a new force was being born to protect the workers' interests. The struggle between the way of the mind and that of the spirit compelled me to absorb myself in work which would give me a sense of objective accomplishment and turn my thoughts away from the inner self. But as the cult of ghosts and spiritualism extended its influence, a whole new realm of psychical manifestations began to be subjected to systematic investigation. Let me read that sentence again. But as the cult of ghosts and spiritualism extended its influence, a whole new realm of psychical manifestations began to be subjected to systematic investigation. During this time, I was taken to spiritualistic meetings by a labor delegate who had lost both sons in the war. He claimed that I had paranormal sensitivities that I myself little understood. The traditions of my early years helped me to keep alive my interest in ghost lore. I read the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Charles Dickens and the remarkable collection of stories by M.R. James. The cult of the dead was kept alive not only by the fiction writer, but by such eminent authorities as F.W.H. Myers and the Jesuit father Herbert Thurston. I had also given some thought to the study of theosophy. I had met Rudolf Steiner and felt that he perhaps had more to offer than most. My imagination could swing freely between the outer world of reality and the inner reality. At night, after the day's work at the hostel, I read Toward the Dawn. In the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, I read that things beyond man's knowledge may not be sought alone by reason, but that what is revealed by God must be accepted through faith. I found in his words both positive and negative answers to the questions raised by my imagination. One late afternoon, I had allowed myself to sit down with a group of ladies who were seeking answers from their dead through the motions of a table. It was in a mood of indifferent politeness that I had allowed myself to participate. I was told afterward that an astonishing thing had happened during the session. It seems I went to sleep and began to speak of seeing the dead relatives of those at the table. Never before having witnessed such a phenomenon and being frightened, they shook me awake. I remember feeling rather uncomfortable. There were lights in front of my eyes, and I had a distinct feeling of nausea. As they related the episode of what must have been my first trance communication, they persuaded me to have this aspect of my unconscious self investigated. I did so eventually, though with a feeling of repugnance. The man to whom I was referred was, I found out later, a well-known theosophist teacher. That's it. A well-known theosophist teacher. He suggested that I should close my eyes and he would help me to find my unconscious self by a process of passes for light hypnotic suggestion. I must have gone to sleep easily enough. On my awakening, the teacher informed me that I had spoken to one Uvani, Uvani, an entity or control in quotes, personality of Oriental origin, who foretold that I would become the vehicle for this type of work, and that for a number of years I would serve in the capacity of a trance medium. Mere explanation filled me with such fear as I had never experienced before. The twilight that issued in this trance condition brought with it a faint regret. I found myself extremely unready to accept the suggestion that any personality outside of myself could use any part of my being. Suddenly, I found a part of me lost on an unknown shore, and this is the part that is so baffling, and which I have taken to so many in the scientific world for study. As long as I can remember, I have carried the thought in my mind that if I were taller than one was... Let me start the sentence again. As long as I can remember, I have carried the thought in my mind that if one were taller than one was, then surely something must happen. As a child, always stretching on tiptoe to search for the handle or the latch above my reach, I was convinced that grown-ups led a different life because they were taller. Only in this way could I understand the leaves that grew beyond my reach, or find the place where the wind helped the butterflies and the birds to soar so easily. This was a form of meditation that always seemed to be part of my makeup. Hence, when there came to me the ability to lose part of my consciousness in the state known as trance, I realized that I had used this capacity at a very early age. I was in the habit of telling myself as a small child that one day I would not hear my aunt's voice when she spoke so commandingly of God's punishment and the price to be paid for wickedness. One day I looked up and I saw her lips move, but I heard no sound. Many years later, I knew a well-known lecturer and politician who traced his deafness to a desire that he might not hear his wife's complaining voice. Had I then, at an early age, discovered all unconsciously a way of disappearing from pain, boredom, and all disagreeable things? To sleep away from it, I called it then. And when the laborers came upon me, curled up wherever I had grown tired, they declared I was talking with familiars. In later years, especially during the war, this escape measure served me well. Hours before an air raid warning announced the nearness of enemy planes, I would carry my infant to another place, and on several occasions I awoke to the realization of what I had done only after I had reached the house of her nurse. I knew nothing of the prevision then, but a disturbance within myself made me know that there was a danger. From a very early age, then, I had learned that the way to safety and certainty was outside myself. A country child, growing up on a large farm, where the sustenance of the people depended upon knowing the very temper of the elements, sees how necessary it is to look for the signs of a new day in the evening sky, or to observe the way of the wind with the clouds in order to anticipate the rains. The flight of the returning birds in the evening sky, the morning departure of the rooks, and the manner of their chatter also foretold the weather for the day. Even the lowing of the animals and the behavior of the insects bespoke sunshine or rain. Morning and evening sounds thus became a guiding barometer of one's life. The ominous creaking of the barn door before the rain fell was a sure indication of its coming. The smell of the linen in the closet contained indications of the near arrival. The whisper of the trees and the dry rattle of the branches foretold the sun's appearance. Firewood swept with liquid flame bespoke a glowing dawn and a burning sky, while if the wood refused to burn within the stove and the laundry, soon the sky would be overcast. These were the narratives of childhood, the actors and the plot that are still more reliable for me in a world of man-made images than the more up-to-date findings of science. In such a way, memory built itself day by day in instinctual patterns through shifting seasons, and the earth shared its secrets with all who would learn. Could this life, lived away from any modern convenience, lived among people whose work was prayer, given back to the earth, have conditioned me to hear and see clairvoyantly? Could this life, lived away from any modern convenience, lived among people whose work was prayer, given back to the earth, have conditioned me to hear and see clairvoyantly? A child forever stands on the rim of magic, remembering the place from whence he came, one foot always poised to return to fairyland, questioning the sky for reality. As night came, I asked myself, what is the crack of doom? Where are heaven and hell? And who are God and evil? The night's shadows revealed none of the answers. But there was a child's eternity, always to be solved. Today, I can recall my questioning vividly. Who were the damned Who were the blessed? Who were the sheep and who were the goats? Did this eternal seeking for the meaning of myself and of the earth of which I was so much a part start the ever-growing intensity to understand eternity? This desire quickens with each succeeding year, demanding more and more research from myself and then from others. In earlier daydreaming, when I knew nothing of the nature of trance, I was, nevertheless, able to breathe myself into a state where I passed through the endless corridors, one contained within the other, at the far end of which there was a tiny beam of light. The corridors were baffling, but not unpleasant, yet when they appeared on the periphery of sleep, I felt myself lost and often left my bed in panic. I have reasoned in maturity that perhaps these everlasting tunnels grew out of my search for the meaning of eternity. The process of reward and punishment could be dealt with day by day, but God's wrath became allied to darkness, and in my imagination the unknown dwelt always close to the rim of night. My ability to go to sleep, much as an animal does, remained with me throughout childhood and adolescence. I contemplated leaving England for the colonies, hoping that a new country and a new life far from old associations would permit me to find a peaceful existence such as had marked my life in Ireland. While discussing this possibility with the Labour delegate at my hostel, who had become deeply involved in spiritualism, he again urged me to accompany him to a spiritualistic meeting. He insisted, too, that I would one day develop my psychic ability to become a sensitive. To emphasize the fact, he told me, he had me hold a folded letter in my hand and then asked me to tell him what I knew about it. Since I felt that I could know nothing about it, I thought it would be safe to tell him the first story that came to my mind as I held the letter, in what sounded to me like a vivid burst of imagination. I spoke of this man's father, of the father's desire to show that he had kept contact with his children, mentioning them by name. It turned out that the letter had actually been written by his father, who had recently died and to whom he was extremely devoted. He was so impressed that he insisted on arranging to take me to the London Spiritualist Alliance to meet the principal, Miss Mercy Phillimore, and other members who could contribute greater understanding of the psychic power. At this point, I was happy to agree, since these bursts of oratory were recurring with increasing frequency. I was immediately attracted by the charm of Mercy Phillimore. She was young and blonde, appealingly beautiful, and had a quality of voice that one remembers through the years. She was also an excellent organizer and manager. I was introduced to several members and invited to hear a lecture, which was to be followed by a demonstration. I was fascinated by the demonstration. Here was a Scottish lady of strong character, speaking of the dead as she saw them clairvoyantly, obviously dedicated to making known the presence of the invisibles. This I understood. I too had seen entities around people on many occasions, but dared not speak of them. I went back to see Mercy Phillimore, speaking in her charming voice, and with her air of quiet determination, she told me about the London Spiritualist alliance of its members' belief in the survival of personality after death and of their search for proof of survival. The gift of mediumship, she went on, belongs to one's basic being. Once these patterns break through, they can be likened to a flowing river, and they cannot be shut off without creating some form of mental anxiety. The lack of patterns or ordered form in such sensitivity is troublesome, but it can be subjected to discipline and controlled. She advised me to seek the counsel of Hewitt Mackenzie, director of the College of Psychic Science.